Sussan Ley is a swamp creature. In my opinion, she represents everything that is wrong with politics in Australia. And if the Liberal Party appoint her as their leader, she may very well lead the Liberals to victory. But in the process, she will destroy what's left of the purpose for which the Liberals were founded, the values and the principles that they were supposed to uphold. In other words, if the next election is a choice between a Prime Minister Albanese or a Prime Minister Ley, then the people of Australia have already lost. In her 24 years as an MP, Sussan Ley has become the definition of a Canberra bubble swamp creature, in my opinion, and is completely unfit to lead the Liberal Party, much less to lead the country. And I have this opinion because, as a political commentator for the last 16 years with a particular focus on irrigation water mismanagement, I've been watching her career now for quite some time. She is the recently returned sitting member in the seat of Farrer, which is a large and sparsely populated southern New South Wales seat, which contains some of Australia's best and most productive irrigated farmland, and an area that I've been studying and reporting on since 2011 specifically. Sussan Ley likes to claim that it's an honour for her to represent this regional seat, but her record as an MP, and especially her time as the Environment Minister under Prime Minister Scott Morrison, suggests that she's just another swamp creature who, again, only in my opinion, is taking advantage of the loyalty of her rural constituents to climb the greasy pole of politics and satisfy her own personal ambitions. Now, I've sat in a few of Sussan Ley's press conferences and other events. In fact, in October 2019, I actually asked her in person a very pointed question about her betrayal of irrigators. We were in front of a room full of press who would never ask a question as pointed as the one I asked that day. And being the swamp professional that she is, she studiously avoided answering my question. And of course, I wasn't allowed to ask any follow-up questions. The microphone was quickly removed from me, and none of the other press were interested in following up either. Of course not. Over the years, I've been given many first-hand accounts from members of the Liberal Party in her own seat about how much they don't like her and why. And I'll include in that the volunteers who were actually handing out how-to-vote cards on election day last week, and yet somehow they still only had bad things to say about her, even as their loyalty to the Liberal Party had them handing out how-to-vote cards for her. They didn't like her. It so happens also that as of 2 years ago, I now live in the electorate of Farrer. Sussan Ley is a swamp creature, betraying her constituents and defying her party members in order to build her career. And after 24 years of swimming in that swamp, she's now very close to being the leader of the opposition and the presumptive future Prime Minister of Australia. My name is Topher. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to understand the world as it changes around you. I am 100% viewer supported. I have no sponsors, no advertisers. I take no money from lobby groups or from anyone. I say what I think what I say, and I rely on you, my viewers, to help me to keep going. So, head over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com and grab a copy of my books, my DVDs, and my merch. Not only will you be getting great and thought-provoking products, you'll also be helping me to keep releasing more videos like this one. Sussan Ley is styling herself as a progressive leadership choice who will help the Liberal Party to rebuild and move on from the failure of Peter Dutton. But actually, she's just a repeat of the failure of Morrison, because in my opinion, she is Morrison 2.0, and in fact it was Scott Morrison who had to personally intervene with his infamous captain's call to save Sussan Ley from being ousted by her own Liberal Party branch members in Farrer, when she was challenged in 2022 by Christian Ellis, an alleged hardline conservative, which is, of course, the modern-day Liberal Party's label for anyone to the right of Stalin. Ellis was part of a broader push by disillusioned Liberal Party members and Conservatives throughout New South Wales to get the Liberal Party to return to its roots, to stand for the values and the principles of the party which Robert Menzies founded after World War II. But principles are like kryptonite to swamp creatures. I cover this in detail in my best-selling book, Good People Break Bad Laws, where I dedicated a few chapters to the issue of perverse incentives inside the swamp, and the fact that people without principles get rewarded politically because they get a seat at the table in every dirty negotiation. See, if you're a politician, but you're known to have principles and to stand by them consistently, no one bothers inviting you to compromise. But if you're known to be a weather vane, willing to turn whichever way the wind is blowing today and wheel and deal whenever it's to your advantage, well then you get invited to have a seat at every negotiation, and you get to make deals and make allies and be owed favours, which means in the long run, the fewer principles a politician has, the more successful they are likely to be. It's the perverse incentives of politics at work. And I'm of the opinion that that is exactly why the likes of Scott Morrison and Malcolm Turnbull have dominated the Liberal Party since 2007, and it's also why, in my opinion, the likes of Tony Abbott are so quickly stabbed in the back. See, Tony Abbott, love him or hate him, had principles, which means that in the swamp, he didn't have a lot of friends. Sussan Ley, on the other hand, has been very successful in the swamp for 24 years, and she has a lot of friends there. And I think that says something. Don't believe me? Well, in 2022, when Christian Ellis came along to threaten Sussan Ley's cushy position as the candidate in this safe Liberal seat of Farrer, the swamp quickly closed ranks to protect her. Then Prime Minister Scott Morrison called her one of my finest cabinet ministers and one of our most successful women in Parliament. You know when they have to reach for the gender card that there's not much else there. Scott Morrison sidelined the will of the Liberal Party members in Farrer, the very constituents which Sussan Ley claims to represent, and Morrison overruled them, making Ley their candidate whether they liked it or not. And he did the same thing in a number of other seats where other non-swamp creatures were making inroads. Conservatives who wanted to bring the party back to its principles were threatening the swamp creatures who were incumbent in those seats. Scott Morrison laughably claims that these captain's pick scandals were actually about protecting the role of women in the party and in the parliament. However, out of the 9 sitting MPs picked by Morrison, 6 were men and only 3 were women. This was not about protecting the role of women. This was about Morrison protecting his factional allies, his swamp buddies, including Sussan Ley, against the people who wanted to get the Liberal Party back to its roots, back to its principles, back to its kryptonite. Morrison protected Ley specifically so that the Liberal Party could continue to migrate away from the very principles it was founded to protect and towards this spineless Labour lightness which has characterised Morrison and sadly now the entire Liberal Party today. Morrison, you'll recall, was a serial human rights violator and locked Australians out of Australia during the COVID panic. In 2022, he led the Liberals to an electoral wipeout against Labor leader Anthony Albanese, and 3 years later, Dutton has just been white-anted by the very same swamp creatures in his party and ended up running a spineless Labor-light campaign at a moment in time when people are crying out for strength and leadership, so hey, thanks to the swamp, Dutton is now relegated to the scrap heap of history. Another victim of the Liberal Party's spineless swampness. And from the perspective of these swamp creatures, the ones in the Liberal Party, getting rid of Dutton was not a failure on their part, it was a feature. See, Morrison's captain's picks in 2022 put an end to principles at the rank and file level of the party. It turned the party into a do-as-you're-told autocracy. If you get too far out of line, if you try to bring us back to our principles, the spineless, principleless leadership will intervene and make sure that you fail. And now, the fall of Peter Dutton is being used as proof that the party's now autocratic leadership must be even less principled than before, even more follow the leader, or should I say follow the Labour, even further to the left. And it's in that context, in the context of a spineless swamp creature party, that Sussan Ley becomes the perfect candidate to lead them deeper into the swamp. Because if you look at her voting history, Sussan Ley plays the good cop whilst enabling her party to stab her own constituents in the back. She loves to point to these amazing ways that she's been standing up for her constituents, including the irrigators. But in my opinion, her claims don't stand up to scrutiny. Let's take the Water Act of 2007, a very dear topic to my own heart. This was the devastating federal takeover of the Murray Darling Basin, which has led to water trading, to billions of dollars being wasted on environmental water buybacks, which have devastated the very rural communities which Sussan Ley claims to represent, and has pushed family farmers into bankruptcy or worse. Sussan Ley pretended to be fighting a rearguard action for them, for the irrigators, claiming credit in 2012 for getting the then opposition leader Tony Abbott to cap federal government water buybacks at only 1.5 trillion litres of irrigation water. She said that this would provide certainty for her irrigating constituents. But as I've covered in videos about the issue in the following years through to 2019, the only certainty farmers had under that deal was the certainty that they were well and truly fucked, and still are. I'll put the links to some of my videos from that time in the description of this video so that you can watch them and see for yourself. Supporting the Murray Darling Basin Plan while bragging about capping water buybacks to only 1.5 trillion litres is like supporting capital punishment, but insisting that instead of an electric chair, it has to be done with only a baseball bat. Yeah, sure, the execution takes longer, but the end result is the same. Time and again, we see this dynamic play out in Sussan Ley's public statements and in her voting record. She is loudly and proudly standing up for her constituents at the margins of a policy, whilst supporting that policy's devastating substance. At best, she's fighting to make her own party's policies not quite as bad as they would otherwise have been, and she parades these fights as if they're proof of her rural credentials and how hard she's fighting for her constituents. But the truth is, she is 100% on board her own party's agenda, and that includes anti-farmer policies like the Murray Darling Basin Plan, among others. More recently in her career, Sussan Ley became the Environment Minister and therefore the holder of the vast amounts of water bought by the Commonwealth Government under the Water Act of 2007. The government spent $13 billion of our taxpayer dollars buying up water on this newly created water market, which the Water Act of 2007 created, and this water was now environmental water bought from farmers so it could no longer be used to grow food. And now it had to be used for environmental purposes, to water wetlands or just be flushed out to sea, as a lot of it has been. So when Sussan Ley was the Environment Minister, she now controlled all of that water. She controlled more water than any other Australian. And she had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make right the wrongs of the Murray Darling Basin Plan, to really truly stand up for the irrigation communities that she claimed to care so much about. Now, I released a string of videos about the water crisis at this time. And like I said, I'll put some links into the description. I made many recommendations as to what could have been done by the then Water Minister David Littleproud and the then Environment Minister Sussan Ley to bring much needed relief to struggling irrigators during that time. But Sussan Ley betrayed her constituents, the irrigated farmers, when she took the job of Environment Minister in a government that was committed to the Murray Darling Basin Plan. And she never even tried to make any meaningful reforms to the way that this federal environmental water was used. She never took up a single one of my or anyone else's recommendations. As Environment Minister, she simply towed the Liberal Party line and did what the swamp wanted her to do. Newsflash. You cannot represent irrigated farmers as your constituents and deliver on the devastating anti-rural community objectives of the Basin Plan. You have to pick one. And Sussan Ley picked her position as Minister for the Environment, another promotion inside the swamp, and she picked that over her constituents. And it was this betrayal of her constituents, the very rural communities which she claims to be so proud to represent, that brought on the pre-selection challenge from Christian Ellis a few years later. And this was the challenge which Scott Morrison then personally intervened to protect her from. She scratched his back, so he scratched hers. She did what the swamp wanted her to do as Environment Minister, in spite of her constituents, and then the swamp protected her from her constituents. It's this chain of events which proves in my mind beyond doubt that Sussan Ley is a community backstabbing career politician, a swamp creature extraordinaire, and she is a continuation of the pattern of spineless compromise and failure which has characterised the Liberal Party since the end of the reign of John Howard, and arguably you could say characterised his reign in part as well. Since then, we've had Tony Abbott, who had some principles, which was a problem in the modern-day Liberal Party, so he was immediately stabbed in the back by the swamp and replaced with Turnbull, who was a swamp creature, who led the party to failure, and was replaced by Morrison, who was a swamp creature, who led the party to an unexpected and very narrow win, and then proved to the world that he really was spineless and lacked any actual values. He was a perfect swamp creature, and so he quickly led them back to failure in the following election, and he was then replaced by Dutton, who was arguably less of a swamp creature, kind of, sort of, maybe, but he certainly allowed the swamp to dictate his recent campaign, cutting him off at the knees and forcing him to back away from any principles that he might have actually had, and so subsequently he has now led the party to abject failure. Swamp creature after swamp creature, failure after failure. Even when they're in government, these swamp creatures still fail. And now we're supposed to believe that Sussan Ley is the answer. Another swamp creature? Sure, she's a female swamp creature. And yeah, I'm sorry to say that that might actually be enough to get her re-elected as Prime Minister in 3 years' time. But we already know what a Prime Minister Ley would mean. She's just another swamp creature, and she'll be just another failure for the Liberal Party. In her bid for the leadership, she's promised to be more consultative and to avoid making captain's calls. And both of these promises are laughable, given that consulting with other people in the swamp is no consultation at all, and she is still only an MP because Morrison saved her political skin with a captain's call. She presents herself as an alternative, as a contrast, but all that she's going to do is be Morrison 2.0. Sadly, hypocrisy is now standard practice in the swamp, and so I'm sure that she can say these things without blushing, and that's the problem. As a woman from a rural seat, Sussan Ley has the optics that the Liberal Party swamp needs right now, and pushing a woman out front is a classic swamp tactic. I did a video recently about how the Labor Party use women to take the fall whenever things are grim. And maybe the Liberals are going to take a leaf out of the Labor Party playbook. I mean, it makes sense. They've borrowed all their policies from the Labor Party, so why not borrow some of the tactics too? But electable or not, Sussan Ley is just another swamp creature. She's been in the swamp for 24 years and it shows. And yes, it's entirely possible that she might make the Liberal Party electable again, but she won't make them worth electing. I've been observing the career of Sussan Ley for a decade and a half, and please hear me when I say this. If the next election is a choice between Prime Minister Albanese or Prime Minister Ley, then Australians have already lost. My name is Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you to keep up with the world as it changes around you. I am 100% independent, and you can help me stay that way by heading over to goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com, grabbing a copy of my books, my DVDs, my t-shirts, or my hoodies. Winter is coming after all. And in the process, you're going to be helping me to do what I do. Thank you for watching to the end. Please like, comment, subscribe, check out this recommended video here, and as always, stay free.